So welcome once again to the Lion's Roar. This is Seafood David A. Ross, and I have a bunch of things I want to talk about this evening on this podcast, but I'm going to start with something. A lot of the things I've discussed before, but as most people know, I spent a little more than the last year translating a book on Shuijiao, and part of that was, trying to determine the correct characters for certain techniques and their actual definitions. And I had said that because this is a product of the Qing Dynasty, Manchurian court, a lot of it you had to look at in classical Chinese. But I also took a list. I mean, again, the Shanpuying, when it broke up, we obviously there's certain terms that are almost universal. Everyone uses them, whether they're in Beijing or Tianjin or Hubei, but there's no physical copy of the way that things were organized. And there was nothing survived that was written. And we assume that the wrestlers themselves may have been very skilled, but probably were either illiterate or at best semi-literate. But I mentioned the fact that in the 50s, they, at least among the Cheng Dongsheng lineage, they had sort of recreated a list of 84 techniques that were being used at the police college, for example, to organize the training for the police college. And, getting to one of the other things I'm going to talk about in a few minutes, the politics of this. Chang's Shuijiao is not, it's Baoding, so it's different than Beijing or different than Tianjin or different than Mongolian. But it's also very specifically influenced by Central Koshu Academy, Central Martial Arts Academy, and also by, the fact that he was training military and police. And then it's also, the more political aspect of this is also the fact that, in 49 they went to Taiwan and operated in Taiwan in its own environment. So, for example, one of the first problems is the fact that some of these technique names and some of these techniques are probably not, or they're not, at least 2 or 3 places I could pretty much say they're not traditional Shuijiao family names, concept family names that probably were in the Shanpuying. These are probably techniques that were borrowed from Judo and Judo cross training. And again, like another thing about the politics of Chinese martial arts is that to somebody who hasn't studied Chinese history, it seems very confusing. Well, Japan and China were enemies in World War II, and you hear about things like, the Nanjing incident, and the way that Japanese treated people horribly, and treated them horribly in Korea, treated them horribly in Taiwan. But before that period, the Chinese looked to the Japanese for inspiration, and there was a lot of cooperation. I mean, for example, Sun Yat-sen, before, he was able to get together his nationalist movement, was in Japan. Chiang Kai-shek went to military training in Japan. The Japanese supported Sun Yat-sen at the beginning. And, I said that Chiang Kai-shek took over in 27, started the Central Goshu Institute in 28, and then actually in 30, the Central Koshu Institute sent people to Japan to study Judo. So one of the first issues is, the fact that a couple of these things are Judo things. And again, especially in Taiwan, remember, Taiwan was under Japanese rule for 50 years, at which point they had really sort of tried to remove Chinese martial arts. They didn't completely do that, obviously, but they had added in, very importantly, especially for the militaristic right-wing Japanese movement that had sort of, taken sway in Japan, that sort of led to World War II. The same idea of, a physical culture, but a militant physical culture was very important. And with that, they acquired Judo and they acquired Kendo and they acquired a couple other methods. And so, Judo and Kendo were added into the curriculum in the public schools. And so in Taiwan, there was a tremendous Judo movement. And there still is, actually, ironically. There was a good article that was just published a couple weeks ago, actually. More of a review of a book that was a little bit older, but talked about, sort of the positive and the negative things of this. And for example, how big Judo is in Taiwan, and the other observation, which is that Kendo stayed very popular in Korea, where it's called Kumdo, and the Koreans are the only people that can consistently field a team for kendo competitions that can beat the Japanese. But I mean that's one. And again, I would normally, this is the issue with politics. I'm going to get back to it in a little bit. Um, if you know me for a period of time, you know that usually I just follow the truth path. My pillars of truth thing, which is just say what it is. But of course, when we were dealing with the personalities in the Shuijiao world, some of them don't want to talk about this, and so for a while I was kind of dancing around it. Not trying to be overtly difficult with people, and trying to stay friends with people that were friends of the teachers in our organization. But I thought I would just talk about this, the fact that we have to sort of acknowledge the Judo influence. I mean, for example, friends I know that do Beijing style Shuijiao said, well, Chinese people got used to being barefoot because they got used to being on tatami mats. Certainly the belt ranking thing, black belts and ranks. I mean, in Shuijiao on the mainland, the belt just keeps your jacket closed, and they use like a red and a blue just for competition methods, but they don't have this, black belt system. And let's just be honest, a lot of people in the Chang lineage had some judo training or judo cross training. One was originally a judo person. We won't go into it right now, but so that was one of the things, is looking through that 84. The other thing also is, as I went through those 84, there was a couple characters I changed because they were simply the wrong character. And that's, I think, more of what I'm going to talk about tonight, at least in this first section here. It is common to have what they call white characters, which is a character that sounds the same but doesn't mean the same thing. That's like a placeholder, especially when people didn't know the exact character. It's common for people just to not know what the character is and use it. Use a character like as a placeholder. So that's why I have these white characters thing. I had I didn't have a sort of similar, I had exactly a similar situation with Chantai-san when I was, running his organization. For example, we have the 10 characters, which are like the combat theory, the system theory stuff. And I had gone and had them written, and I always use only traditional characters, not simplified characters. Chantai-san, being sort of poorly educated, I think is the best word. Remember, he was an orphan. He was raised by monks. I mean, he could write, but he sort of used a mixture of simplified and traditional characters. Sometimes he used white characters, and so I did this list, and Chantai-san was like, "Well, it's not the list that I had written down." And I said, "Well, one, this is the traditional of the simplified you used, and this is not this character. This is that." And Chantai-san notoriously got very angry at me and went down to Chinatown and had somebody rewrite it. And my training brothers went, "Well, he wants it that way," and put it up that way. And subsequently, I've seen also that because we didn't stick to truth, people didn't learn what the real characters were. I've seen some people put up those 10, and like at least 5 of the 10 are wrong. I mean, completely wrong. And some of them are like just not even this. They're sound the same. They're homophones, but they're not the same character at all. I had a lot of this situation with Chantai-san where he used characters so they were white characters because maybe he didn't know what the real character was. He wasn't educated enough, or he was used to using white characters. And I had this sort of similar situation with this. And it's interesting because I was sitting down on Sunday, and sort of one of the things that indicated this with Shufu James, his wife, who's a very educated lady from Taiwan, and she said, like, I remember looking at the characters, and I'm not a martial arts person, but I remember thinking, I don't think these are right. I don't think these describe things. And she said, when I looked at what you were doing, and I said to her, well, I had to go through all these dictionaries and look at the classical Chinese. She goes, I think you're more right. And it comes down to this, though. What does this mean? Well, obviously, you know what I think about Chantai-san. Obviously, you know what I think about Master Zheng. There's no question that these people were very skilled and knew how to fight, knew how the system worked. But it's almost like a rule that when it comes to Chinese martial arts, the people that spent all their time really learning how to fight with this stuff, and often were in the military, Zheng and Chantai-san both were, are not the most educated people. And this corollary to that is some of the most educated people that know the exact character and know all the great stuff. Well, they're very educated, but they don't know how the system works. And I have a very famous story, which I've told before, which I'll retell right now. Charlie Fut is a big system. There's a lot of people that do it. There's a lot of different lineages of it. There are a lot of different ways of doing it. For example, you can see like the same form name, and like 5 people will do it, and it's 5 different forms. And we were in San Francisco, and we were at a big tea at one of the big tournaments, and there was at least 4 or 5 different teachers that represented 4 or 5 different versions of Choy Fut. And Chan Tai-san was there, and somebody who was I won't name names, you know me, I'm not going to name names, but somebody who was a pretty high-profile Choy Fut teacher was talking about how, they had the exact correct names and had the original, the poetry, the Kunpo, which is, from, Chan Hyung's village in Gingmoy, and excuse me, was criticizing people for using like you said, like a lot of people are basically like farmers. They don't know the names, so they use this like names, and the names aren't correct and everything. And it got to a point where one of my training brothers said, well, a name is a name, but if you know how to use it, that's what's really important. And he said, well, no, if you don't know the names, you don't know the applications. Well, I don't know if that's true. And so we said, well, what is your, the most chew now is what he calls it. We call it hot, right? It's the same technique, different names. Well, what's your application? And push came to shove. Well, I don't want to do it in front of your teacher. Your teacher might be offended. And what was interesting is because this guy is a little full of himself, a couple of the other teachers, Choy Fut teachers, instantly turned to Chan Tai-san and said, do you care if we do some application stuff right now? And Chan Tai-san, being Chan Tai-san, said, no, I don't care at all. And then when push came to shove, the guy kind of backed out of it, kind of tucked and ran. And again, like, probably he had exactly the names as they were originally used by Chan Hyung and Gingmoy. Maybe he's right about having all the poetry and everything, but that doesn't mean he can fight. And the fact that Chan Tai-san and maybe some of the other quote-unquote, farmers or peasants back in China didn't have the correct terms doesn't mean that they didn't know how to fight. They did know how to fight. And it seems like it's almost like that. And in Shuijiao world, we have people that I looked at and I said, oh, I think their characters are right, but I don't necessarily know that they know how the system works. And then I looked at people like, Master Zheng and said, well, he definitely knows as far as showing you, like, this is where you put your foot, this is how you turn your hip, this is how you turn your waist. And this is sort of a standard thing in Chinese martial arts. But it's also sort of the reason, like, we're kind of in the situation we are, which is that we have, and again, this is sort of endemic to all Chinese martial arts, and I talk about it a little bit in my history book, is that educated people that didn't know necessarily so much about how the style really worked were able to write a lot of stuff about it, and sometimes apply their own biases and their own delusions. And then the people that were really good were not necessarily as good at promoting and organizing and things like this. So it's part of the way where we are. We have to sort of find that middle ground. I frequently said, if you listen to me, like, I often, I've put it in my books, it's in black and white in my books. I consider myself like a funnel or a conduit, which is that I'm not going to say anything about, it's irrelevant to my own skill. I don't need to tell you I'm great. I'm not as good as Chan Tai-san or Master Zheng or some of the other people I've trained with. But it's kind of irrelevant. In other words, I'm a method by which you can get information. It's, the messenger is not the message. Don't worry about me. We all have skeletons in our closet. We all have warts, and, I'm not very handsome and bald and, blah, blah, blah. But the message is the same. But I think that what Chinese martial arts needs is both the people that know the full applications and people that are at least intelligent enough to organize and present it. And also, as I said, knowing the character doesn't teach you how to throw somebody, but it can add to your education. It can give you insights. And it shouldn't be throwing the baby out with the bathwater. It shouldn't be either or. If you can have the right character, you can have the right information about it, but you can also have the right training methods. That is a way to move forward with Chinese martial arts. But like I said, unfortunately, up until this point, it was either the educated people that didn't really know much about how the system is done, like nuts and bolts, kind of way, or you had the people that were great fighters but not that educated, did not organize things that well. I mean, the lack of organization is astounding. One of the things I always find so appealing about Hong Yishang's organization that sort of, made me attracted to them even years before I did any of their material was the fact that here was somebody that could fight and understood how the system really worked, who also had the wisdom to organize it. And that was really important. Moving on to organizing and doing things, we have, again, one of my friends who does Beijing's Shui Jiao was talking about the international competitions. And I had mentioned something that, because it applied to Sancho, which is that, as he said, international competition, China can send 2 teams. They're all pros. Hong Kong and Macau puts together teams, and it's like guys that were like champions in Mongolia and Hubei, Inner Mongolia and Hubei, and then the Mongolians send people. And it's very hard for an amateur team that trains part-time to win in a competition when, basically it's pros. Same thing as Sancho. I mean, you would be an amateur by American, modern Western and especially American definitions, sports commission definitions and athletic commission definitions, and you go to an event and you'd be fighting somebody that just fought in Pride a week before, literally. And you'd be fighting Russians that had like 200 fights, and, the USAWF got to the point where they were sending people that had 4 or 5 fights, and maybe 3 of those fights were at the national, team trials. So these were not very experienced people fighting people that, had fought like 1,000,000 times. I know when the Iranians defected and were in my gym, these guys had hundreds of fights. They had done, versions of Kyokushin, they had done Daijujuku, they had done Muay Thai, they had done Sancho, they had done boxing, and this makes a difference. My problem with Sancho, when I was trying to promote it, I was making good progress until, the forces not only, China hated us because we were trying to go a different route. The USAWKF hated us because we were going a different route. The athletic commissions came in because they wanted to control it. In California, it was really messy. One of the members of the California Athletic Commission tried to form his own Sancho Federation. I mean, it was just looked corrupt. It was unethical. It was a conflict of interest. And then, of course, the MMA thing came and killed it. But one of the things we were trying to do was, for example, I used to do shows and people used to complain, like, there's no pros on this show. It's all guys in, like, their first or second fight. Well, you have to get somebody experience. And, the guys were sloppy because some of them was the first time fighting or their second time fighting. Fighting another guy with their first or their second fight. But that's how you build up athletes. In other words, I wanted a class system. I wanted a C, a B, and an A. And you don't get to A until you've had like 10 fights or 10 wins or something like that. Because you don't just throw people to the wolves. I remember at the USAWKF National Tournament, I had a guy, he had been training. He was a tough guy. It was his first fight. And his first fight was against Kung Lee, who was already, I think, like 3-time national champion. And I think had already gone once to the Worlds. That's rough. When you take somebody that maybe had done one little local Shui Jiao tournament in the United States where the competition pool was almost non-existent, and you send them to fight Mongolians, don't expect them to do well. People also have, martial arts ideas as opposed to coaching ideas, as opposed to sport ideas about how you get ready for things. And as long as you have this secret thing where, like, you don't want to, like, teach people stuff because you're keeping secrets, well, you're not going to develop good athletes, right? And this is the difference between being a quote-unquote martial arts master and being a quote-unquote combat sports coach. Excuse me, I have a bad throat this evening from my allergies. It gets warm, and that's the consequences. And I pointed out, which Shui Jiao people know, the Shampu Ying, were the Manchurians, and initially they lost to the Mongolians consistently. Then they started having the ability to win sometimes, just sort of like the Koreans in Kumdo before, because they started practicing. And one of the reasons that they were successful among them were they were willing to mix Mongolian, Manchurian, and Chinese methods and find out what worked. They weren't looking for, tradition, purity kind of stuff. They weren't holding back. They were showing people the best stuff. If they knew something worked and it was great, show it and use it. It doesn't do anyone good to keep secrets. What are you keeping secrets for? For them to die with you? Another one of the things that really you know, aggravate me. And they did a lot of conditioning, which then became, like nowadays I see people referring to shui jiao qigong, and it bothers me. There are a lot of conditioning exercises, but first of all, they were never referred to as qigong. For one, first simple reason, the easiest one to tell you is that Chang was a Muslim. Most of the Hubei Baoding people were Muslims, and so they had a different worldview than the Han Chinese, ethnic Chinese. But they believed in conditioning. Don't think otherwise. I mean, if you've seen those Carl Gotch crazy conditioning things, those came from predominantly Muslim countries that were doing wrestling, and India also, Hindu countries that were doing wrestling. And Indian martial arts are really interesting because you see things that you would be tempted to call internal, but they just don't have that concept in Indian martial arts whatsoever. And, wrestlers who get down in the dirt and roll around also will do these, kind of yoga looking like quote unquote internal kind of things. And they just haven't, because they don't have the same historical, cultural, and political context that led to the creation of this term, which, I argue in one of my books, in the history book, is not what people think it is. There's no term internal in Indian martial arts, in Persian martial arts, in Arab martial arts. And really not in Muslim martial arts. And what's interesting is Xingyi comes out of Muslim martial arts also. The other thing we were joking about recently is, apparently the Sanjai Jin, form, which is most people associate with long fist. There's versions of it in Xingyi. It's probably originally from Xingyi. And I point out the fact that, things are so backwards in Chinese martial arts that we look at long fist, and they call it Shaolin, but it was never in Shaolin. It's an amalgamation of several methods. There's praying mantis in it. There's Muslim long fist in it. There's Xingyi in it and stuff. And yet they're calling it Shaolin, just throwing together. Just like they call Xingyi internal and then act like it was created by Taoists, which is interesting also because then, some people say Xingyi was started by Yu Fei. Well, Yu Fei wasn't a Taoist, and they say he learned Shaolin. The stories don't even make any sense, which is why, we need to put our big boy pants on and confront these things. With sports, again, going back to what I was saying about, and this is the problem we had with Sancho too, which is that people that were big famous masters because they had people that could do really nice, pretty forms would then put their senior students on a lei tai and they would lose. And the term in Chinese is it's bad for your rice bag, meaning it's bad for your income, bad for your money flow. It's easier to be a martial arts master than it is to be a coach. You put a lot on the line. I find it interesting. I was criticized because at the beginning, when I was training fighters, I wasn't an experienced coach. Well, you can't start off as an experienced coach by definition. You start off, you coach, and as you keep coaching, you get more experience and you get better at it. And again, a lot of people don't even want that criticism, so they won't even put themselves out there. They won't even, take the chance of being criticized. It's easier just to wrap yourself in a style and say, I'm a master of the style, and I'm going to teach you all the forms and not necessarily have to prove whether I know how the fighting works. And that's what happened with Sancho because, it was interesting because North American Chinese Martial Arts Federation, NACMEF, started doing full contact events again. There had been sort of a lapse. Weihong and the East Coast, Eastern United States Kung Fu Federation, East Coast Federation is what it's called for short, had been doing full contact events. The very first full contact events done in this country were done by Chinese, which, most people don't realize at this point. And, they were doing basically like a version of kickboxing, that term that everybody hates. This is why Paul Fizio came out of this scene and then became, a multi-time world champion, taught by Weihong. But there had been a lapse in this, and they started doing it again. And what's interesting is Jason Yee, my friend, who is the most successful coach in U.S. Sancho history, and who also, won a bronze himself at the first World Sancho tournament. A fighter and a coach and an actor and a producer and a writer, a very talented guy. But when he first came back from China, he's like, "What are you guys doing?" Because he didn't have the rules right. But they had started doing this. And when they first started doing this, all the traditional Kung Fu schools were trying to put people in to fight. And at first I thought it was cool, and certainly what I was interested in doing. Really quickly, when people weren't doing well, the traditional people left. So that we ended up getting what they called the Big Six, which was full-time Sancho teams. And what's interesting is that Kung, myself, Mike Altman, Scott Shealy, and Jason, and the Oakland team, all six of us, all six teams, all had traditional backgrounds, but we just decided to focus on producing fighters. I mean, you could do that. Nobody was a pure Sancho coach. I mean, the one that I learned from Chade-san military Sancho, which had a different focus. I mean, he wanted us to spar and have gloves on and stuff, but he also wanted to learn how to disarm knives and bayonets and gun defenses and stuff like that. Jason probably had the most sports Sancho background because he had been training in China, and like I said, he fought in the first world tournament and won a bronze. But it's interesting that as Josh Bartholomew, who's one of Jason's fighters, said, he had the Kung Fu Daddies, these guys that would show up in the full uniform and try to do bagua walking and get knocked out in, a round. How many of them ran away? Because it's much easier to be a martial arts master than it is to be a combat sports coach. I would say, well, no, actually, what's interesting is the Sancho people, we all got, not politically correct term, not safe word, we all got screwed over. And what's interesting is, most of us ended up doing Muay Thai and MMA. And, for example, Kung himself fought MMA at the highest level, fought, Vanderlei Silva in the UFC. Incredible. It's interesting how many of us not only did Muay Thai, but did MMA and did it very successfully. Mike Altman worked with Saul Solis, who's a great MMA coach. Just got his black belt actually in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. We should congratulate him on that. Moved on. The same thing with Shui Jiao. If they wants to be successful, and again, I'm unfortunately tempted to have low expectations because there isn't really any organization promoting it. Very few people would want to do. Maybe people want to compete and be a master, be a champion and go to an international competition and win a title and then say it. But very few people want to do the grunt work of organizing an event, writing rules for it, fighting the powers to be to make those rules, setting up a tiered system. And also, honestly, what I see in Shui Jiao is sort of a limited, worldview that sort of holds it back. As I said, if you don't want to teach basics because you think they're secrets, can you imagine a wrestling room where they don't teach you arm drag and sprawls or shucks, or snap downs? I mean, because they're secret? I mean, no. The best wrestling teams are the ones that have the most experienced coaches and where, they know which techniques work, and so they drill them all the time. And then, they have something that maybe the coach works on. John Smith had his single leg, and a lot of his people that, he coached had that. Gable had his own approaches to things. And again, but this is all related to Chinese martial arts and this sort of backward view of things. I mean, I'm going to look right into the camera as I do this and say it, but, I hate to break it to you, but there is nothing in Shui Jiao that we cannot find in Western wrestling. They don't have jackets. The grips are different, but all the techniques are there. Shen, where you reach over and grab the belt, and you can do like a lat whip where you're literally grabbing the back, like the lat muscle and using it. I mean, literally, you just change the grips. Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu people know this because they have gi and no gi and everything. A lot of people are I was actually just talking about David Rudman. I don't know if you guys know who David Rudman is. He's probably the most successful Sambo person of all time. But he was also a Judo person, right? Put on long pants instead of short pants, put on a jacket that doesn't have, the military style to it. And then he was also a wrestler. Ron Tripp, who's Mark Tripp's cousin, but he calls him his brother, who is, also a tremendously successful judo coach, and also did Sambo and, beat Hicks and Gracie in a Sambo event that, became very controversial, even though it shouldn't have been, was also a wrestler. There's nothing, and again, there's nothing in Shui Jiao that you can't see in Judo, but there's nothing in Judo that you can't see in Sambo. There's nothing in Sambo that you can't see in Shui Jiao. It's just, I mean, other than maybe the ground submissions, but I'm talking about just the stuff that everybody's, obsessing over. I remember, I mean, and James is my very good friend and my teacher who granted me rank and everything. But I remember when I first went there in the 80s, I already had second-degree black belt in Hapkido. This led to the problem, right, which was that one of the other, in case people don't know, I came back to Shuizhou after having not been there for, almost 30 years. Why was that? Well, I was training there. I probably would have stayed. But one of the seniors took exception to me and tried to make problems. And so, Master Cheng was like, oh, I don't know what to do. And I was like, don't worry about it. The easiest thing for me to do is just leave. I had already met Chante-san, so it wasn't a big deal. And it wasn't the first school that I had to leave. But what's interesting is, the guy was like, he's just trying to steal our Shuijiao secrets, and even James, I went there and I was training and I was like, dude, I have a second-degree black belt. I have Keto. I've seen a lot of throws and joint locks, obviously. Plus, I had done Hung-ga with all the Chin-na. That was part of the traditional Hung-ga curriculum. I had been trained by people that really knew what they were doing correctly. And they tried to show me something like, this is unique to Shuijiao. And I remember, which is probably what put me on the bad side with the other guy. And maybe even with James at the time, we all reconsider our relationships as we get older. I remember saying to them, but we do this in Hapkido. And again, Hapkido comes from Japanese Jiu-Jitsu. It's all a big circle. It's all the same stuff. It's what I used to say when I was in college, which also used to aggravate people. What happened was I went to college for another side story. I do these a lot when I start talking. And I saw that there was a martial arts club, and I showed up at the martial arts club. And my full-time career teaching started off by converting almost every single member of that club who had different martial arts backgrounds into a student that was then coming to the dance studio that I was renting and becoming students of mine. And one of the things I used to say to these people when I'd show up was, it's all the same stuff. I don't care whether you think you do Aikido or Taekwondo or Karate. It's all the same stuff. People think that, Shuijiao has all these secret things. Everybody thinks that. Sambo people think this. You have these people that are deluded into thinking there's a thing called combat Sambo. People that think, well, I learned the combat version, so I'm better than David Rudman. David Rudman was world Sambo champion, 6-time champion of the USSR. 3 times was the runner-up. You can just look at all the stuff. I mean, was a European Judo champion, took a bronze in the World Judo Games in '69. I mean, he was the best there was. And I don't care if you think you do some kind of combat version of it. I'll quote Chen Dongsheng again. If I can touch you, I can hurt you. And I know I can touch you. If Rudman wanted to grab you, he'd grab you. And if he grabbed you, he'd throw you. And there's nothing much you could do about it. Wade Chalice in wrestling, people said, if he wants to pin you, he will. And there's nothing much you can do about it. And that's why he was, one of the most decorated wrestlers of all time. People get into this like everything is special and a secret. It's not. It's nothing special. It is good marketing and it is good padding for weak minds and insecure people to tell them you do something. I think we see this internal all the time. You don't need to sweat and work out and work hard, and bleed maybe. You've got chi, and you can shoot it through jalapenos and make people dance in circles. I mean, we've seen all the ridiculous things about this. So, this is why I don't have that much faith in Shuijiao going very far, because it's become so mired in the martial arts, the typical martial arts nonsense. All you have to do is see it. Since Chang died, people self-promoting, giving themselves rank, the wonderful thing, and I say wonderful thing being sarcastic, is, these self-promotions. Don Drager once came to the United States and gave an interview, and paraphrasing it, basically, he said there are more 9th-degree black belts in the New Jersey Yellow Pages than there are in all of Japan. People just love promoting themselves. And so, I see people now. I mean, I said to James Sunday, I don't know what day it is, but when we were training, everyone wore white belts, even James and the other seniors, and I don't even remember discussing the belts. I don't even remember it. I know that, a couple years later when I was in NAGMAF, you know, when they started doing this full contact thing, and what they did was they invited these Russians team, and I talked to them. What was interesting is they were a Russian team that had three levels team: A, B team, and a C team. The A team was in Beijing fighting like National Sancho team. The B team was in Los Angeles doing an event at Benny the Jets gym, and the C team came to fight in Baltimore. The C team won every match against the Americans, and one of the things was, because it was kind of a Sancho format, even though, like I said, they didn't have the rules quite down, was that they knew how to kickbox and throw, whereas most of the people that the Americans, the organization Baltimore put up, were strikers, kickboxers. And I was sitting on the NACMAF executive board at the time, and there was a meeting after this event, and people were talking, and I said, it's great that we want to do these full contact events, but and again, going back to this idea that you have to train people, you don't just throw them into competition and expect that they're going to do well, is we have to train them to throw. Interestingly, Derek Mims, who had fought in Taiwan under Dean Chin, said, oh yeah, Dean Chin told us when we were going to go fight in Taiwan, you better start working throws. And this is where I met Daniel Wong, who is, one of Chang's students and has his own organization. And I'm just going to point this out. At the time, he came up to me and said, well, who are you and what is your background? And I said, well, I'm no one really, but I trained a couple of different things, We were talking about throwing a lot. Well, I did some shui jiao. Who did you shui jiao with? And what the irony is that at that time I didn't know that Jing Xiaoping was such a famous high-ranking guy. I just knew he was a shui jiao teacher in New York. And I said, oh, this guy. And I remember Daniel going, well, how much do you know? And I go, I don't know. And I go, well, you know those tapes. And at the time I didn't know how valuable that black and white 8mm tape from the police college is. I go, the stuff that's on that tape. And just to make my point, Daniel Wong offered me a third-degree black belt at that point. He wanted to bring more people into his organization. He was trying to build up his organization. He said, based on what you're telling me, you'd be about a third-degree black belt. And he followed up by calling me when I went back to New York, calling me from California. And I said to him, and I stayed, friendly with him, and probably still friendly with him when I saw him again. It was not I didn't want it to be perceived as a slight. I guess I'm just not interested in ranking. It just doesn't mean anything to me. It's all political. So for people that claim I was, looking to gain ranking, well, I could have gotten ranking, and that was 1992. So, what if I had been a third-degree black belt in Shui Jiao in 1992? But I remember ranking not being important. I don't ever remember it being important when we were training with James and Master Zhang in, the Eldridge Street location, or in Hongying House, which is, where Master Zhang ran his classes. And yet now I see people doing 8th degree, 9th degree, 10th degree. And I said to James, I bet in a couple of years we'll have a 12th degree. I remember Toyotomi Miyazaki, who was probably one of the best Shotokan people ever. In New York especially, he's a legend. He was 5th degree, I think. And that was awesome. Americans getting to 3rd was awesome. I got to 2nd in Taekwondo. I know people that got to more, but now rank is so inflated. It's like inflation. A 9th degree now is like a 2nd degree it was, 20 years ago. And, it is what it is. You don't need the Hoist Gracie quote, which is a good one. A belt only covers 2 inches of your ass. The rest you have to cover yourself. It's politics. Well, why does somebody want to promote themselves? So that they can be better, higher than someone else. That's the only reason to do it. And, I'm going to share with you my philosophy, which is that everybody thinks that life is a pizza. So that if I have 6 slices out of a pie, that means you have 6 slices left. Life is, in fact, a pizzeria, meaning that I can order a pie, you can order a pie. Somebody can come in an hour later and order another pie. Somebody can come in tomorrow and order another pie, and we can all have full pies, and we can put whatever we want on it. If some of you want to put pineapple on it, I don't know why you'd want to do that, but go ahead. It's, what happens is then it becomes the crabs in the barrel thing, which is everyone's pulling everybody down. And that's why we have all this ranking stuff. Who cares about ranks? The only reason to have rank is to encourage beginners. If you're already a black belt, you shouldn't need that encouragement. Um, trying to say you're these high ranks, and who gives these ranks? Um, Officially, it is well known. Like the Mongolians get when they win like a big event, they get like a belt that actually has gold on it. But in Chang's style, it became known as a gold belt. It is known that before David Lin Shikai, the David Lin that established combat Shuijiao, came to the United States, Chang rewarded him with a gold belt. The only one that got a gold belt. Why did David Lin Shikai get a gold belt? Well, he was the best fighter. And again, interesting too, because, we were talking earlier about this. Zheng is more senior, maybe has more technical knowledge, but there's no question that David Lin was the fighter. I mean, there's no question among anybody in the Shuijiao organization. Daniel Wong is known, for having produced a lot of materials. He wrote the first book, very educated. He wrote two PhD theses, I think, one in Taiwan and one in the United States related to Shuijiao training. Again, but like Daniel is not really that much into the quote-unquote combat aspect of it, which is okay. Everybody has their own strengths. But what's interesting is who's giving out these ranks. Chang passed away in 1986. And this is sort of segueing into the last thing I want to talk about, which is that, Master Zheng wasn't very political. Certainly, as somebody in his position, he could have done more in the Shuijiao world. Could have argued, like a lot of people did, that he should be running the Shuijiao group. He didn't get involved in that kind of stuff. And in one sense, that's very positive. And, if you know me, I've been preaching for years. I don't want to get involved in politics. I don't want to belong to an organization that would have me as a member, or to paraphrase that, say anything thing. I don't want to sell anything. I don't want to buy anything that's sold. I don't want to produce anything that's bought or sold, blah, 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 blah. But the other interesting thing is that it's one thing to just, walk around the edges of politics and stay out of it, which I totally agree with, and mostly what I prefer to do. The one, thing that sucked about getting back involved in Shuijiao, while I'm happy to have helped translate all this stuff, and I am happy to, have taken on the program that, Master Zheng used to teach, and I will continue to teach Shuijiao, and certainly I will continue to put out stuff, and I don't believe in secrets, and, people are upset that I'm showing stuff that's supposed to be secrets, and I don't care. But what is interesting about politics is, by the same token, and again, I believe that in most cases I'm consistent with this, that means if you're off doing your own thing in your own school, I don't care. There are a lot of people that train with Chantai-san or train with students of Chantai-san. There are people like running their own schools, and there are people that learned a little bit and then mixed it with Wing Chun or something, or karate or taekwondo or whatever they did with. And you know what? I'm not going to go around saying your correct rank is this and that's not the way you do this technique and stuff like that. I'm not interested in that. If you know why I went after Gus Capros, it's because if you defraud people or you do something that is unethical, then that's not politics. That's, part of preserving truth. And so for those things, you should speak up. When people try to do, and again, Chinese martial arts is interesting because, for example, there is a picture. I don't know if I'll put it up on the YouTube version of this, and this one's gonna go public. There's a picture of me seated, and if you knew Chinese martial arts, you know what that is, with people behind me that later on you would know as Chantai-san disciples. That's because, remember, the initial group was, Lorette had met Chantai-san. Lorette then introduced Steve Ventura and I to Chantai-san. And then, for a variety of different situations, Steve Ventura relocated to Florida, and Steve and Lorette did not want to bicy because he wanted to bicy with Judo, the praying mantis teacher. And so it kind of de facto left me as the sort of administrative head of the group, and I ended up becoming the person that ran the classes. And what happened was you'd show up at those classes because they were publicly advertised, and if you didn't know anything, I would walk you through the basics, which Chantai-san had zero interest in doing. And then some of those people could then, once they had some basics, become students of Chantai-san. So, the argument is, well, if you train with me at the beginning and then you train with Chantai-san, whose student are you? And, we have this with Wang Yun Lum in Mamapai earlier on, And Master Zheng's school was sort of the same. When I met them, the public class that was advertised that you could go into and everyone was welcome into was being run by James. And so, in one sense, James is my teacher. But I was also going to Hongning and training with Master Zheng at least until this, senior, got their nose disjointed about that. So it's always fuzzy lines in Chinese martial arts, and that's why this leads to this. But if you were trained by somebody and their teacher had already retired and wasn't accepting new students and wasn't really training people on a regular basis, was only showing up every once in a while to do like seminars and looking over the class, you can't say you're that person's teacher. I mean, that person's student, that's your teacher. And people do that. And when people do that, they should be called out on it. When people say like, well, 10 years ago, they said, well, I don't want to do your system because, to the teacher, because it's outdated and it's anachronistic, and I'm going to like mix it with Jeet Kune Do and make it something else. You can't come back 10 years later and then wrap yourself in the style flag and say like, I'm defending the honor of the style because, I want to keep it pure. People have trouble with the fact that, if you know me forever and a day, I've used the spelling of Shui Jiao, Shuaijiao, which is the pinyin correct, I would argue correct all around spelling. But then you've seen me use, when we were talking about Master Zheng, Swai for Shui. Would not be my first choice, but by the same token, if that's the spelling that he used in 71 when he came over here, you're being historically accurate. You're also showing respect to the man because that's the spelling that he chose. If you went, screw that, I hate that, then you can't go back and say, well, but I'm so dedicated to the honor of the association. If you want to go do your own thing, that's fine. The official statement that was put out by the Chinese Shui Jiao Association under James was, we welcome people to join us, we welcome people to be friends, and if you're doing your own thing, best of luck. We offer you, we have no ill feelings toward anybody. The association's motto is, through martial arts, make friends. So, I applaud being apolitical. Certainly we saw, a lot of nasty politics after Cheng passed away, and I applaud that Master Cheng didn't get involved in any of that and sat by and just decided to train his students, and then also had an open door to like help any classmates or other people associated with Cheng learning material. That was a wonderful thing. It was the best thing. But you can't be so political that you also don't keep your house clean. And I had the same problem with Shantae-san. Probably my biggest arguments with Shantae-san that often ended up in screaming matches in restaurants. So people from the 80s and 90s remember this white guy and a Chinese guy screaming at each other in Toisanese, and other Chinese masters getting in between us. I have my Shantae-san's temperament, at least did back then. I've mellowed significantly with age. I think even my students would say that. But, again, this is sort of like they don't organize things. They don't organize their systems or their things either. The worst Chinese are the ones that are super political. And we have a lot of examples of that. Then we have the people that just don't care, and that's just as bad. You have to sort of find like a middle ground. Like, the Buddhist thing about it's a middle path. It is neither, far right or far left, and I don't mean that in political terms. But Buddha said, first he was overindulgent, like Epicurean, and then he was, like starving himself and, living living in the jungle in a loincloth and not eating, and beating his body. That's, neither one of them is good. It's the middle path. The truth is always somewhere in between. And again, it's probably also, related to what I was talking about earlier, which is the sort of universal thing, which is that, nobody owns truth. You can't claim to own truth. You can't obscure truth. It's there. People that seek it will find it eventually. The more you attempt to obscure truth, the more damage ultimately you do to yourself, and no one else, really, honestly. So for those people that are trying to steal pieces of pizza, you're missing the point. I mean, another thing that I posted this week was, I've published 50 plus articles that were published internationally. I have 11 DVDs, 9 of which I'm actually doing, and 2 of which I produced with students of mine. And I have 10 books. I have, all my accomplishments as a teacher and as a combat sports coach. And none of that precluded anyone else from doing something similar or following their dreams. It's not like there's a limited amount of success out there, and if I have some, it's coming out of your mouth. Don't get mad, get motivated. That's good. I think I originally said, don't be jealous, be motivated, but I think it's better saying don't be mad, be motivated. If you're upset that somebody else is getting all this attention, do something to get your own attention. We have the group, the open group in Facebook. It's got, almost 9,000 followers. My YouTube channel has almost 2,000 followers. I have blogs and this podcast and everything. You can do that. There's nothing special about me. I've just said earlier today, there's nothing special about me. It's really not even about me. Mostly the people that come to me, I would say, don't really care, like if I was a great fighter, or, if I can, stick my finger through wood or something like that. The people that follow me and the people that listen to these things and the people that are interested in what I do is interested in the knowledge that I'm offering them. Not me. I'm just a conduit. I'm just the vessel that's giving it to you. If you want water, you don't worry about the garden hose. You just worry about the water that's coming through the garden hose. I'm just a garden hose. Don't worry about me. Don't even care about me. Don't obsess about me. But this is, I've seen it my entire life in Chinese martial arts. And it's the reason why Chinese martial arts are where they are. And a lot of other martial arts and a lot of other things in life. Human beings don't play nice with each other. One of the things you learn in political science really quickly is that, people constantly try to organize human beings, and the problem with that is the human beings. So, I went over a couple of things, and they're all kind of interrelated, as you can sort of see as I'm wrapping up here. If you have any questions, as always, you can direct them to me through the different channels that I'm available for. As always, thank you so much for tuning in for the Lion's Roar, and have a pleasant evening.